There we go. Okay, let's start that again. Thank you for joining this School of Living Zoomcast. School of Living's mission as a nonprofit educational organization is to explore challenges of living, hold land in trust for present and future generations, promote personal empowerment, and support the development of just and sustainable communities. While there is no charge for this Zoom event, we appreciate a suggested donation of $20 or as you can to help support the work of School of Living. Better yet, consider becoming an active member of School of Living. You'll find the link for donation and membership in the chat box. Today, we are happy to have Andrea Ferich presenting. She will give a brief overview of 6 main agroforestry practices and potential income generating opportunities for fruits, nuts, and cut flowers in these perennial systems in Pennsylvania. Andrea Ferich is a forestry consultant through her business Ironwood Forestry, focusing on the implementation of agroforestry systems with private landowners across central Pennsylvania. She has worked in sustainable agriculture, ecological restoration, and watershed management for the last 20 years from urban and rural settings. She was recently appointed as Vice President of the Pennsylvania Native Plant Society. She also sits on the steering committee of the Keystone Tree Crops Cooperative, the Pennsylvania DCNR Riparian Buffer Advisory Committee, and the Chesapeake Bay Foundation Silvopasture Advisory Committee. She has worked with over 25 landowners in the last 3 years in the planting and distribution of 15,000 trees and shrubs. Prior to graduate school, she was the executive director of the Penns Valley Conservation Association, and she enjoys propagating native plants and bird watching. You can find out more about her work at her website and on the Ironwood Forestry Instagram page. The links will be in the chat box. Andrea is looking for support for the work of Keystone Tree Crops Cooperative. Keystone Tree Crops is introducing a model for generating right livelihood and economic equitability for those who work with bioregional tree crops. The best way to show support is to go to the website and sign up as a participant. Labor, crops, resources, and financial support would be very helpful. The link is also in the chat box. Welcome, Andrea. I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm a friend and big fan of Dale Hendricks, and I'm really standing on the shoulders of a radical collaborative community of people who've been coming together over the millennia, caring for these trees, and the last century in Pennsylvania with settler forest farming systems, and then the last few decades of people protecting these trees and returning to the opportunities that are available to us with tree crops. So yeah, I'm an agroforestry consultant. I am a consulting forester. I have my own business here in Center County in Pennsylvania. I'm halfway between State College, Penn State, and Bucknell. And I'm gonna basically talk about agroforestry and economic opportunities. I'm getting a little bit of audio if people could mute themselves. Trying to stay focused today. So I'm going to talk about the agroforestry practices. I'm going to look at planning for your land, planting, management, and then we're going to go into further detail about these agroforestry practices as much as time will allow us. I love this work. It's so inspiring for me to be involved in something that's so holistic and sustainable and is part of a movement, a collaborative conversion of building new economic opportunities while preserving our ecosystems, working toward improving water quality and habitat, both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem improvements. I want to start off just by saying that some of these slides have been shared with me from a variety of different collaborators. The Savannah Institute, which focuses on agroforestry in the Midwest. Pennsylvania DCNR, my good friend Tracy Coulter. She's the agroforestry coordinator for the state. Penn State University Cooperative Extension. And Zach Elfers, my good buddy, who I sit on the steering committee for the Keystone Tree Crops Cooperative with. Now, when you think about agroforestry, think of it as both art and science. It's a blend of a variety of different economic and ecological opportunities. Agroforestry is a transformation of row crop agriculture toward perennial systems that are closed loops and are thinking about future generations. We're thinking about climate resiliency. We're thinking about different practices all across the landscape, from the lowlands along the waterways to the hedgerows and property boundaries. We're thinking about multiple parcels pieced together, managing for bird habitat, managing for trout, looking at establishing cooperatives, finding resilient ways to connect the supply and demand, value-added product development. There's so many opportunities for the landscape through agroforestry. So these are the 6 main practices. Riparian forest buffers, basically the areas along the waterways, creating buffers between a variety of different land uses and the water protection. Alley cropping is establishing rows of trees, and in between those rows having alleys of either perennial or annual cash crops while the tree crops are establishing. Silvopasture, having animals within your pasture integrated with trees for fodder, for forage, just for human consumption, multi-use of land uses. Hedgerows, the old-fashioned property boundaries marking the landscape, these marginal lands that have a variety of ecological and economic opportunities. Windbreaks, which are a variety of hedgerows that have a specific design around reducing impacts on the land, whether it's wind or snow or smell. And then forest farming, which is actually farming in the woods. We're going to take a closer look at these after I sort of go over an overview of how I'm thinking about these agroforestry systems. So when you're thinking about agroforestry and tree crops, I'm going to say J. Russell Smith's book, Tree Crops, is a good start. You basically want to be looking at returns for the short term and the long term and how you're thinking about your systems. If all we do is plant hickory trees that we're waiting 20 years for production, we're going to get hungry and poor pretty quickly. So we want to be integrating elderberries and hazelnuts, cut flowers, which are producing within 3 to 5 years, having staggered incomes of production while we're waiting for our 20-year tree crops to come into production. You want to be mindful of that when you're thinking about your system. And I'm sort of speaking to you as either landowners or business owners who are looking to start to get involved with the tree crop economy. Perhaps you're a natural resource provider giving advice as a consultant to these landowners. Or maybe you're just getting your feet wet thinking about how do these systems work for my community? What are the opportunities that are already there? Because these are mostly native species that I'm talking about. There's elderberries all around us. You know, I grew up in Lancaster, and I live in Center County. When I go to visit my parents, there's elderberries all along Route 30. You know, there's black locust flowers from here to Philadelphia. There's hickory trees. Zach Elfer's presentation a few months ago on hickory trees. These are legacy trees that have multi-generational relationships. These hickory trees could be growing and living for up to 600 years. that's not just one person's planting. If I planted a hickory tree when I was 2 years old, it's just coming into production. I'm a little older than 20, but we'll get into a little bit more detail about these species. But since I'm only talking for an hour, I could honestly talk for an hour and a half straight off the bat just about elderberries. So we're not really going to get into too much detail. I'm really excited about the funding opportunities that are available for these products. I'm speaking to you as though you live in Pennsylvania. You're not necessarily a landowner, but some of these fundings do apply on the national scope. For riparian buffers, the areas along the waterways, which is most of the work that I'm doing, is I'm working with private landowners on their land as a consultant. There's $5,000 an acre for me to talk with these landowners and implement these projects on the ground, which is a lot of money. There's also money through Penvest for riparian buffers. Some of you might know that there's loans for buying land for beginning and disadvantaged farmers who might not necessarily be eligible for loans from the bank. There's opportunities for cost share payments through the USDA NRCS, which includes funding for riparian buffers, hedgerows, establishing greenhouses, windbreaks. We're hoping that there's going to be more funding for alley cropping here. DCNR has funding right now for conversion from lawns into meadows or lawns into forests. If you go to the listserv, the email grants.gov, you can sign up to get daily or weekly emails with specific grants that you're looking for. If it's education, if it's research, demonstration projects, collaborations, go to grants.gov. It's a great place to get your hands in the ground, shovel ready projects. And with all of these funding opportunities and whatever you're going to be doing, I'm here to tell you partnerships and building collaborations, building these networks, it's the only way you're going to be able to actually have success in these projects. Tree crops don't work in isolation, maybe a little bit on the cottage scale, but you can go to your conservation district and have a specialist come out to your land and walk with you. You can contact the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, local watershed organizations. Penn State Extension has a lot of resources as well. Okay, so let's say this is a property you're looking at establishing a variety of different agroforestry practices. Where do you start? Well, I like to start with asking, what are the landowners' values? What are their intentions? We're diverse people across very diverse land uses. And some people really love their property or love their neighbor's property for a variety of reasons. They might love it for beauty, or might be inspired to plant trees because they want to improve habitat for birds, or they might want to have some harvesting opportunities with tree crops. And likely it's a combination of everything. So you want to start out by walking the land, getting familiar with the land and the water. With these increasingly extreme weather patterns that we have, there's a lot of reasons to get to know your land better. With the extreme flooding, with the droughts, fires, not here, fortunately. You want to spend time really getting to know what are the extremes of the property that you're working with. You want to take measurements, take time to sketch out your dream plan. Because believe it or not, there is going to be some way to find some money that's available to you to reach your goals as a landowner. There's a lot of money available. I like to walk around properties with a handheld GPS unit and take coordinates and say, okay, this is the property boundary. Okay, this is where we're going to build the house. Okay, this is where that hickory tree is that we love. This is where we saw that red-headed woodpecker. And, you can take those GPS coordinates on your phone, even if you don't have a handheld GPS unit, And then there's all sorts of free software online that's available for mapping and beginning to, put together a plan. You can do super high tech, you can do super low tech, a combination of both. I really like this combination framework. So I usually bring GPS coordinates into Basecamp, which is free software that allows me to bring it into Google Earth. And this image here to the right, this is a riparian buffer design I'm working on in Spring Mills area. And it's a 5-acre buffer project, riparian buffer. And, those sketches were just made as polygons in Google Earth. It's pretty straightforward. If you have Google Earth Pro, it's free. You can open it up, type in an address and start drawing right away. You can print it out and then start drawing from that actual landscape. And then from there, you can get as complicated as you want. There's all sorts of resources, collaborations for high-tech mapping, but you really want to have your framework built within the natural and cultural resources of your property. You want to be thinking about questions like, how wide do I want my rows? Because I want to get a tractor between these trees to mow for management. Or my grandma lives next door and she's an exceptional baker. I really want to work closer with my grandmother. Maybe I can start planting a medicinal and edible hedgerow that integrates the elderberries that she used to make into pies. Or maybe your questions are, we know that we're on the edge of woodcock habitat and we want to do what we can for those timber doodles. So we're going to start planting aspens everywhere. Those are some of the questions that you want to be asking yourselves. And of course, there's all sorts of other online resources for mapping soil, topography, flow lines of water, and open source software for mapping, such as QGIS. Now, when you start planting, you want to be thinking about the multi-story cropping systems. You want to think about the canopy, the understory. You want to be thinking about the ground covers. Thinking about these layers, not just space over time, but also vertically, horizontally, looking at your soils. Things as simple as pH. Where should I plant my blueberries? Where are these hickories going to thrive? When I'm walking around the landscape, I'm always looking at where are the walnut trees, because as many of you know, walnut trees are allelopathic, which means there's a lot of other trees and shrubs and vegetables that aren't going to do well with walnuts, especially members of the rose family. They are really inhibited by the juglone chemical that the walnuts produce. Taking measurements in the field, doing those hand sketches, and then having flags. You can get your hardware store flagging your dreamscape. And then you're also thinking about seed mixes, that herbaceous layer. There's a lot of resources online for purchasing native plant seed mixes. I really like Ernst Seed Company, and Pheasants Forever also has some really great native plant seed mixes for drilling into your project as an understory and ground cover. So when you're thinking about your design, there's 3 main resources I want you to look at first. The USDA Center for Agroforestry training manual out of the University of Missouri is exceptional. It goes over in detail these 6 agroforestry practices. And also looking at the non-timber forest products calculator, they're called NTFPs. This will help you to establish, a framework of your products. Sorry, somebody's audio is on. I'm easily distracted today. Let's unplug. You're unplugged. And then there's also conservation buffers that are part of looking at design considerations for buffers, corridors, and greenways. These are three resources you have to start off in. In these pictures below, you can see before and after in a riparian buffer to the left and center. And then the image on the right is a hazelnut. So the hazelnut and the bitternut hickory are two of the tree crops that the Keystone Tree Crops Cooperative is focused on for this first year. I'll get into that more later. But the bitternut hickories, hazelnuts, and chestnuts, just keep those tucked in your pocket because they're all across the landscape and they're high economic returns, and the processing inputs are low. So when you're starting to get into agroforestry, hey, go out there and just jump in with other people. Start to get to know, your neighbors or people in your community who maybe already have pawpaw trees. Go talk to your local winery or brewery and see what kind of fruits they might be interested in integrating into their production. But I really want you to start to process these crops. Sometimes I start walking with landowners and they get really excited. They want to plant 500 pawpaw trees. Well, this fall, the pawpaws are in the middle there, that green fruit. It's a native tree that tastes like a banana or a mango. I collected about 100 pounds of pawpaws from where I grew up in Lancaster along the Susquehanna River. And it was an insane amount of work processing these pawpaws. But I got to experience it, and I'm absolutely increasing the cost tenfold. So I processed these pawpaws and sold them to our friend Joan, who runs Mount Nittany Kombucha. You can see there on the left. And it was wonderful. It was exceptional. But get to know these crops before you put a big investment of your time and money into them. So the elderberries there to the right, that's elderberry wine. I went down to our local winery here in Millheim in central Pennsylvania in Center County. And they're basically excited about all the elderberries they can get. They're excited about native wines, which is exciting for me. But there are some processing overhead time costs related to these crops. You have to really love it. It's a labor of love. And what isn't there to love about walking around in the woods and going nuts? So here's a look at some of the nuts that can grow in our climatic hardiness zone. Not all of these are native, but some of them are. This slide was shared with me from Emily Schwackhammer from Penn State Extension. She's a horticultural specialist. And, there's hardy pecans that will grow here. There's all kinds of hickories that are so delicious, that are all around us already. You don't have to just start these trees from seed. Walk around and get familiar with the bitternut hickories. Look for those yellow buds. There's black walnuts. Some people are still harvesting conventional black walnuts in our areas. And then, did you know that pecans and hickories will cross and make a pecan? When you're planting, you want to really make sure that you're working with improved genetics. That bottom center photo, you can see our friend Dale there. That's down at the J.W. Hershey Forest Farm in Downingtown, Pennsylvania. Zach Elfers talked a bit about J.W. Hershey's forest farm in his presentation, but basically the genetics are available for tasty, large, delicious, uniformly ripening fruits and nuts all around us. You can see in the upper right there, those are black walnuts in my hand. The big ones are from J.W. Hershey. The little ones are the ones growing on the trees here in Center County. There's a variety of different nurseries where you can plug into. After this presentation, we're going to make a list of resources available to you soon that will include a variety of different nurseries and local businesses that you can support as you're looking for these improved genetics and cultivars. So down in the bottom right there, those are hazelnuts that I bought from our friend Zach and his nursery. And as I'm working with landowners all across the landscape, I'm really trying to integrate as many of these improved genetics from local nurseries as possible. You don't want to wait 20 years for a hickory tree that has really tiny little nuts. you want to you really want to make sure you're planning in advance. So this is one of the case studies. This is one of my projects. I was previously director of a watershed organization here in the Penns Valley area, and I'm really excited about these riparian buffers. So you can see on the left, it was a vegetable row crop farm, and it, in the fall of 2018, rained so hard that the farmer couldn't even get in to pick those tomatoes. So we transitioned this vegetable farm into an agroforestry farm. And in those rows, it's an alley cropping system within a riparian buffer. Basically, an alley cropping system means that there's space in between where you're growing for production annual crops between perennial trees and shrubs. So those are hazelnuts, elderberries, and black chokeberries in those tree tubes. And within a year, we planted sunflowers for cut flower production while the elderberries and black chokeberries and hazelnuts are producing. Elderberries, I could talk about them forever. I love them so much. There's an incredible market opportunity for Pennsylvania and the mid-Atlantic around elderberries. And here's a list of the different varieties of cultivars that are available. It's a cultivated variety that's selected for production. And with elderberries specifically, a lot of people say, oh, I never got to my elderberries because the birds ate them all. A lot of these cultivars are selected for heads that droop down, so the birds aren't sitting on them and eating them. The heads are drooping down, they're larger, they're ripening uniformly, they might be tastier, there's a longer season of production, and they have really cool names. There's also all sorts of resources available through the University of Vermont around spacing for your elderberry production. You're going to be thinking about these rows, spacing in between the plants, spacing in between the rows, and what are your goals of plants per acre? And growing for production is going to look different than growing for wildlife opportunities. Even though it's a lot of the same species, there's slight tweaks in the design aspects. So, there are ways to blend the two and create hybrid designs that are both meeting production and wildlife goals. And I'll get into that in a little bit. There's a lot of room for innovation, especially with these tree crops and the products that we're using to develop these forest farm systems. So we developed an elderberry destemming machine here. This was a market need. A lot of people are really hesitant to get into elderberries for production because it's so labor intensive. Some people can just freeze the elderberries, and it's a great way to get them off the stem. But if you're growing for a winery, they don't want them frozen. Some people have concerns that if you're freezing the elderberries, maybe their nutrient content isn't as high. So find a machinist, find yourself a farmer who knows how to make machines, and start to put your ideas together. So we talked about nuts a little bit and fruit a little bit. Cut flowers are sort of the third area that I'm very excited about the opportunities, especially within riparian buffers along the waterways. So you can see the bottom right, that's my friend Sabina Carey and her partner Tom. And she runs the Pennsylvania Cut Flower Growers Network. And there's a variety of different perennial trees and shrubs that you can integrate into your cut flower business. A lot of these species in wet soils, you can just take a cutting while the trees or shrubs are dormant and stick them in the ground and they will root. And it's like magic. So you can see in my wheelbarrow and buckets there on the left, I had a bunch of cuttings from the local florist here in Milheim and brought them out to my demonstration site and did a few rows of these cut flowers. Now it's growing into what we're calling a cutting block, where we can either be cutting and sharing for others to propagate, or cutting and growing for the cut flower economy. And I had heard one time that Pennsylvania imports the equivalent of $80 million of woody cut florals into Pennsylvania every year. And there's no reason that we're not growing all of our pussy willows and dogwoods here. That number feels really high. You can integrate the fruits and nuts together. Don't just think in straight lines. This is a little keyhole shape. We have all sorts of feminist slang that we call this design, and integrate those fruits and nuts together. I like to integrate pawpaws with chestnuts. They seem to grow really well together. These are a little bit more upland. You don't want to be planting them in wet soils. They do well together. 10 feet on center and 30 feet between rows. Now, when you're thinking about management, you could plant 1,000,000 trees and have deer eat all of them. So you really have to be thinking about, how am I protecting these trees and how am I preventing competition from overriding them? We talked about landowner values a little bit before. Seems like there's a pretty big divide between landowners I work with people who don't want to use any sort of chemicals, such as herbicides, and then other people who really don't have a problem integrating herbicides into their management. One of the innovations that's been happening in recent years is using stone around the bases of the trees to reduce competition. In a lot of our systems, moles and voles are eating, girdling our trees and shrubs, and the stones seem to prevent that habitat cover and enabling the moles and voles from devouring through your aspen trees. Some people are also using sheet mulching to reduce competition. A lot of you permaculture gardeners know what sheet mulching is, laying down lots of newspaper or cardboard and then covering it with leaf, compost, mulch, building up this organic matter and then planting into it. And that layer will kill the grass or the goldenrod that you're trying to prevent from competing with your perennial crops. Now, as a forester, I probably spent 90% of my time trying to beat the deer, and it's tricky. You've seen in some of my other photos the tree tube, that plastic, terrible, ugly cylinder that we use to prevent the deers and groundhogs from eating our trees and shrubs. I'm working with two wonderful mechanical engineers looking at actually doing a 3D printed prototype of a biodegradable tree tube. Every winter I sort of become obsessed with trying to make it happen again. And I think we're gonna actually make it happen this winter. In this picture, you can see that there's two sort of fences around those quaking aspens. And in that design, it's actually a behavioral fencing system where the planting is surrounded by two fences around the whole entire perimeter that are about 8 to 12 feet apart from each other. And they're so close to each other that a deer won't jump inside, but they're so far away from each other that it's too far that the deer won't jump over both. So this has been a successful, low-cost system for deer exclusion fencing. And the other sort of innovation that I've been learning a lot about it is the Miyawaki plot design. And basically this is a high intensively planted area that replicates a young forest that might integrate 100 trees within 100 square foot area. It uses a broad fork to really break up the soil, lots of compost, and this intensively planted area allows for the trees and shrubs to grow very fast and get established quickly. I've also been really in love with what the Horn Farm Center has been doing. This is an example of some deer exclusion fencing that Wilson Alvarez, the woodland steward at Horn Farm, has innovated. I'm not exactly sure what he has planted in there, but it looks like there's some rich compost that's surrounded by this string, just wrapping string around the area. Again, those tree tubes might keep a deer from eating your trees or shrubs, but it's not going to guarantee it's not going to come out like this or come out like this or moldy or, it's just not really imitating the natural systems. And I'm trying to transition the agroforestry and forestry community with my work towards more of this blend of permaculture and regenerative agricultural framework. So of course, there are some bottlenecks in how we're thinking about agroforestry. It's not funding, it's not projects, it's labor. Just this spring coming up this year, there's potentially 35 acres that I'm working with in Center County alone, not to mention this regional network between here and Lancaster of different project partners that I'm working with. So the labor model, there's a few ways I've been thinking about this, establishing pick your own type frameworks where maybe you're bartering with people who have assets of strength or muscles or time on their hands, or maybe even developing an apprenticeship network. I think again about this radical collaboration, the opportunities. I want to build an economy. I don't want to just focus on my business, because the more thriving businesses there are in this work, we're going to lift each other up. And, if there's 25 agroforestry consultant businesses in Center County, that means there's going to be a lot more elderberries on the landscape that we can pick and process and make into elderberry syrup and getting into the value added products. And, processing is a bottleneck. There seems to be a pretty big gap between the supply and demand that's local. So Pennsylvania, there's a lot of these cottage elderberry syrup industries where people are really excited about elderberries, especially during pandemics, and finding ways to keep the supply as local as possible with the demand chains. And, there's wineries and cooperatives that want to buy as many elderberries as they can between here in Harrisburg and Lancaster and all in between. So I've been really excited about this work with the Keystone Tree Crops Cooperative. So we're focusing on the bitternut hickory, which has those yellow buds, and the shell on those nuts is so thin that it can be pressed without being deshelled, and it's tasty and delicious, and it grows all around the landscape. And a lot of people don't know the bitternut hickory as a hickory tree. A lot of people who are even connected with their land don't really realize that it's a high value opportunity with an oil that has a high cooking point and is tasty and delicious. So the Keystone Tree Crops Cooperative with Zach and Dale realized that we can start to get people to go out and collect these nuts. So they got a few hundred pounds, maybe 100 pounds of bitternut hickories, and it translated to I think the number that they said was a few $1,000s worth of oil. And I hear that it's tasty and delicious. And we're looking to do the same thing with hazelnuts, planting a lot of those improved genetics, and chestnuts, looking at flower. But like with the elderberry cooperatives, not everybody needs to market their own elderberries. We can have aggregators. We can have business models with people going around with electric bicycles with destemming machines on trailers on the back in urban areas or suburban areas. And again, I think that there's tremendous opportunities for innovation. I'm working with a hemp farmer with industrial hemp fiber, and Pennsylvania hemp field, at one point we were the leading hemp producer in the world. And there's incredible opportunities with hemp oil and hemp flour and integrating it into these agroforestry systems. But again, there's processing bottleneck there that needs innovation. So now I'm going to look at some of these agroforestry practices in detail. We're going to look at riparian buffers, alley cropping, silvopasture, hedgerows, windbreaks, and forest farming. So some of these slides are from our friends from the Savannah Institute, and some are from DCNR, and some of them are my own. So a riparian buffer is the area adjacent to a waterway. A riparian buffer has all kinds of ecological value. It is improving the water quality. It's lowering the temperature of the waterway, which fish need. It's improving the organic material that the macroinvertebrates need to eat to feed the fish. It's decreasing the sediment and nutrient pollution in the waterways. It's stabilizing the stream banks. It's adding woody debris that's helping to slow down the waterways, providing floodplain protection. And within this framework of the multifunctional riparian forest buffer, it's integrating tree crops, lots of fruits and nuts and cut flowers, fiber and forage. So here's a closer look at the DCNR's model for multifunctional riparian forest buffers. And it's generally divided into three main zones. The first zone is right along the waterway. It's generally unmanaged. You're not going in there and cutting down trees. It's a really wild feel. And the second zone is this hybrid feel where you're maybe doing some design for production with fruits and nuts. And then the third zone, we're looking at more of the harvest designed for integrating mechanization. So getting the phosphorus out of these floodplains through removing the woody debris, or removing biomass, or removing cut flowers, those sorts of ideas. So I'm going to fly through these because I'm going to run out of time, but we can revisit them. Maybe my slides will be made available. So again, there's the first zone. It's about the first 15 feet of the riparian forest buffer. There's a variety of different species that you can integrate. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation has free trees and shrubs for you for your riparian buffer. So last year, off the top of my head, I think I got about 5,000 free trees and shrubs from them. And it's amazing. They have a goal of planting 10 million trees in Pennsylvania. And you can find more about that. Visit the Chesapeake Bay Foundation Keystone 10 Million Tree Initiative. Then zone 2 is basically integrating these fruits and nuts into usually an alley cropping system, these long rows where you can design for production that's also, not necessarily a monoculture of perennials. And we're looking at serviceberries, pawpaws, hazelnuts, elderberries. And the third zone, again, this is basically usually from the end of the second zone to additional 50, I'm going to say to 300 feet. So the DCNR money goes up to 300 feet away from a riparian buffer. So it's those cut flowers, and you're allowed to use mechanical harvesting for, harvesting those elderberries. Let's look at some of the species. Thanks for the slide, Tracy. When you're establishing a riparian forest buffer, you don't want to just stick trees on the edge of the bank like a Band-Aid. You want to be looking at actually improving the waterway. And in Pennsylvania, all across the mid-Atlantic, most of our waterways co-evolved as forests. I think it's 97% in Pennsylvania. And you can see in this photo on the left, a steeply incised bank. This waterway was likely channelized, made straight during the agricultural revolution to optimize production of corn and soybeans and monocultures. And with this incised bank, every time that flooding happens, it's going to slough off more of that bank. So you want to work with the technical service provider who can help you stabilize those stream banks. There's really low impact ways to do this with sticking logs in the edge of your stream, or you can go and work with Trout Unlimited or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who can come out and depending on what sort of funding they have available, they can help work with you to make a design. They might be able to provide or find you funding, work with you to implement in-stream stabilization structures. Your county conservation district, especially if you're in Pennsylvania, is a great way to start. Reach out to those providers, and they will love to get out of the office and come down, as long as the pandemic is, And then that picture to the right, you can see our friends from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They came out to a project that I have in Georges Valley here in Spring Mills. And we did a 4-acre native plant seed mix that they seed drilled for me, landowners, that I got from Ernst Seed Company. And it was tailored to the landowners' desires for beauty. And I always toss in a bunch of cut flowers. And maybe you can also be thinking about native dyes. There's a lot of flowers and perennials that you can integrate into all sorts of functions. Here's a case study I'm gonna take a look at. This is that fall of 2018 was quite a doozy. We planted about 200 elderberries in my friend Sarah's property. She's a midwife and an herbalist. We integrated a medicinal riparian buffer and a medicinal hedgerow at her property. And it was underwater for 3 days, fast moving water, and none of those elderberries died. So, a lot of these riparian forest buffer trees and shrubs are really designed to last. Well, there's Sarah with her family. We planted 1 gallon elderberries from Octorara Nursery, and within 2 years they were producing. Yeah, I know, it's pretty wild. And Sarah is a practicing herbalist, and she can tell you how excited she is about having native plants that provide ecosystem function and these socioeconomic opportunities. And also requiring less maintenance. Once we got them established, she goes around and mows, but it was designed as a silvopastoral system, which means when she does get her sheep, she'll be able to graze them around the elderberries, and they're going to knock back the competition competing grasses. So here's a closer look at a basic map of her project. Since she's also a beekeeper, she was interested in trees and shrubs that have pollination throughout the spring and summer. So basswood, black locust. She had a lot of black walnuts, which she integrates into her women's health practices. Raspberry, crabapple, black cohosh. It's really exciting. You can come out and visit. I'm sure we're going to have some field days. You can also visit Sarah's Etsy shop. The link's provided at the bottom. I think for me as a consulting forester, it's extremely exciting to help landowners getting these products scaled up. So our next practice is called alley cropping. So here, thanks again to our friends from Savannah Institute, Katie Adams, who is super great. She shared these slides with me, and we co-presented at the PASA conference this year, Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Agriculture. And it's virtual this year. We recorded our session and we're presenting it later on this month. But there's a tremendous amount of information that I can't even cover in this session. Katie has all sorts of demonstration projects with the Savannah Institute in the Midwest. But basically, allocropping is growing cash crops in between the rows of trees and shrubs while they're getting established. And it's really this give and take between economics and shade. As the chestnut trees are growing, they're going to outshade the asparagus or the switchgrass or the blueberries that you're growing in between. So there's a lot of information on the USDA Center for Agroforestry, University of Missouri Agroforestry Manual. I can't even begin to get into all this information right now. Basically, there's a variety of different crops that you can integrate into the alleys. And there's also a variety of different trees and shrubs that you can have in the rows. Most people are looking at nuts, maybe some fruit in their alleys, in their rows. And then sometimes there's timbering that's happening. Usually with black locust or quick growing species, you don't want to grow a hickory tree that you waited 40 years to grow and then cut it down. But the black locust you're managing maybe on a 12-year rotation, and those black locusts are great for all sorts of no spray applications for organic farmers, like fence posts or garden raised bed materials. There's all sorts of benefits, increasing diversity ecologically and economically for the farm. I think the systems are beautiful. You want to be thinking about whether you're doing single or multiple species within the trees. Diversity is what we're going for. You might want to do single or multiple rows of trees. And there's also, spacing between rows, depending on what types of cash crops you're growing in between the trees. You might choose a different amount of spacing depending on the length of time that you want sunlight to be hitting those crops. So it really depends on the types of values that you're looking for, but you want to be thinking about light competition, root competition, and the allelopathic aspects of what you're growing, specifically with the walnuts, because they're gonna outcompete most of what you're growing and kill them. So silvopasture is another one of the practices that I'm really doing a lot of in my work. So what is silvopasture? It's basically integrating trees and shrubs within a pasture where you're raising animals, giving a home for animals, or maybe raising livestock. So you can either think of this as establishing the trees in the pasture where your animals are grazing, which is most of what I'm doing, or you can be establishing pasture grasses in the woods, which is usually thinning out the forest stands to allow light to come in for your warmer, cool season grasses. There's a variety of different benefits for integrating trees and shrubs into your pasture. Basically, there's a wide range of opinions about how toxic some of these species are for animals. If you're really concerned about animal toxicity, if you have pets that you have on pasture, you can go to Cornell Veterinary School. They have a list of trees and shrubs that are toxic to a variety of different animals. Or the SPCA has trees and shrubs that are toxic to animals. But then within sort of more of the agricultural livestock community, most people who are practicing silvopasture are under the pretense that most of the animals are going to self-regulate and they're not going to eat all of the only black locusts, enough black locusts to kill themselves, basically. So, there's this continuum, and there's not necessarily a lot of research on um, how silvopastoral systems are interacting with the animal digestive systems. There's a lot of research about the protein content. Zach talked about these big fatty honey locust pods that he's growing from seeds that he saved from the J.W. Hershey Forest Farm. A lot of people are integrating um, nitrogen fixing species within silvopastoral systems, which are usually black locust or alder, to help bring some of those nutrients back into the soil, reduce nutrient sediment runoff. And silvopasture was ranked recently the 8th most effective climate mitigation strategy by Project Drawdown. So there's a lot of hope in integrating these trees and shrubs. So this is a design that I'm working on for our friends down at Village Acres in Perry County. You might know them. They're a CSA, and they have a certified kitchen where they can do value-added product development. They're interested in integrating trees and shrubs in the silvopastoral system into a pick-your-own design. And they're grazing in between this hybrid riparian buffer alley cropping silvopastoral system. The main consideration you want to be thinking about are the light needs and also your equipment needs. You don't want to try to get your tractor in there. If you need 15 feet of clearance, you need 15 feet of clearance plus a little bit in that turn ratio. Here's another silvopastoral system I designed here in Woodward. The rows are protected with an electric fence, and basically this is designed on contour using a laser level to reduce erosion concerns. And there's specific species that you want to avoid within these systems. Black cherry will kill a lot of different animals, and different laurel plants. I also designed a system for the Lancaster Farm Sanctuary. And these animals are not livestock. They were rescued from the industrial agricultural system. And these animals are on pasture for life. And it was an incredible opportunity to get to learn so much about a wide variety of dietary needs and restrictions of any kind of possible animal that might come to the farm. And basically what my conclusion came down to with designing the silvopastoral system is if it's good for the horses, the rest of the herd will be okay. The rest of the residents are going to find the fodder that they need with these perennial hays. So horses are really picky. There's a lot of fruits that I couldn't integrate. Here's a basic design for the Lancaster Farm Sanctuary. You can see those black and gray plants. Those are mostly willows, and then there's also some hickories and chestnuts and different dogwood shrubs that the horses can coexist with. And then hazelnuts also do well. Mulberries are okay with horses, and blueberries. And that's about it. The hickories do well. Everything else had to be integrated up front. You can see all those red dots. That's the pick your own area that's designed into this hybrid riparian buffer silvopasture alley cropping system. And people will likely pay to come and pick those trees, and maybe as they're doing intensive rotational grazing, they're not just letting the animals or the residents of the sanctuary loose on this free for all. It's intensive, intentionally managed rotational grazing. to make sure that nothing's overgrazed. So there's in that pick your own area up front, there's pawpaws, elderberries, American plums, black chokeberries. So I guess I'm running out of time. So I'm kind of gonna fly through these last three practices. I grouped hedgerows and woodbreaks together. Thanks again, Tracy, for the slide. And basically, hedgerows have gone through 3 rounds of being planted and taken off our landscape since the settlers arrived. So the first round was a lot of hedgerows were planted by settlers in the land grab, and then they were removed off the landscape until the Dust Bowl happened, and then the hedgerows were planted again on the landscape. And then they were removed again during the Industrial Revolution to get bigger tractors through. And then they were planted back on the landscape through sustainable agriculture. And then windbreaks are sort of a version of hedgerows that are utilizing advanced techniques to reduce the impacts of wind, snow, smell on the landscape. So here's Sarah again with her medicinal hedgerow. We got this established in 2 years. It was lots of love. We got bare root seedlings from Coldstream Farm online, and did some sheet mulching. A lot of the impacts of the Dust Bowl were due to the removal of these hedgerows. Again, you can read more about this in Tree Crops, which was written 100 years ago, basically predicting the Dust Bowl. And, we're at a place right now where we're at unprecedented rate, sort of approaching a lot of the dynamics that could lead to a global sort of Dust Bowl. So the hedgerows really make a difference. These windbreaks actually work, and removing them makes a difference on the landscape. Here you can see, again, some of the impacts. There's a waterway going through there across the road, but that's dust. So these windbreaks might be planting single or multiple rows of vegetation. That Center for Agroforestry manual that I mentioned earlier has all sorts of detailed planting descriptions on how to integrate native trees and shrubs into functional purposes, such as windbreaks and hedgerows on your property. They work with living snow fences, increasing irrigation efficiency, reducing dust and odor, helping people to become better neighbors. So the windbreak systems specifically have design considerations that look into the height of the windbreak and the width of the windbreak that are actually helping to serve functional objectives for the landowner. You want to look into the details in the agroforestry manual that I described. Here's a snapshot you can see on the right. You can get pretty complicated pretty quickly on the height, species composition, the width, and the distance from the windbreak, with different types of wind speeds, direction, prevailing winds. You want to be thinking about what your objectives are. And in terms of the hedgerows, I found the Xerxes Society has really great resources on planting hedgerows for pollinator habitat. You can also read Doug Talamay's books on looking at what species the Lepidopteras, the caterpillars, moths eat the most of. Basically, if you're feeding the caterpillars, you're feeding the bird community. So look at Doug Talamay's book if you're interested in integrating wildlife. Some people are integrating switchgrass or grassland habitat in between these rows. And, there's just all sorts of ways that you can make beautiful functioning ecosystem services through these agroforestry systems. The last practice that I'm going to just touch on is forest farming. And this involves the cultivation within your existing forest. In Pennsylvania, a lot of people are growing ginseng, golden seal, cohosh. They might be growing cut flowers, mushrooms. Some people are doing maple syrup production. And there's basically a few different ways of approaching your forest farming design. You can go into your existing forest and start removing invasives, sort of thinking about approaching your forest as a garden and keeping that forest cover intact. Wild simulated might be integrating, maybe some shade cover, but you're planting seeds within your forest, growing some ginseng, trying to make those roots look like they were wild collected. There's also a few other different strategies. You can find more in the agroforestry manual. I'm really excited about mushroom production in forest farming. This is a great chart I found online a few years ago. You can see there's a wide variety of different trees that you can take logs from to produce different types of mushrooms. Maybe some people consider some of these trees kind of trash trees. I don't like to call any tree a trash tree, but some people might not like the hickories that are leaning over into their property, or there might be a developer who cut down a bunch of oak trees, and you can find some of these different types of woods to integrate into your mushroom production, forest farming. Of course, there's ginseng. Last year I aggregated ginseng seed for landowners and help people to plant it and grow it. The main concern, of course, is deer browse. A lot of people integrate dogs or fences or lots of woody cover over where you planted. And the last slide here, this is a list of trees that actually produce the equivalent of what you can make into maple syrup. Some of these are actual syrups, and some of them are more like flavors that you can add sugar to. But did you know that you can make maple syrup out of all different kinds of maples? It doesn't necessarily need to be sugar maple. The sugar content might not be as high, but if you're really excited, you can start tapping those black walnut trees. There's more information on the Penn State Extension website. Dr. Eric Burkhart at Penn State is an exceptional resource for ginseng in the region. Plant Savers, United Plant Savers has a forest grown certification, which is the equivalent of certified organic for growing things in your forest, in your woods, so that people know that it's not poached and that you're using regenerative practices. And DCNR also has a bunch of resources on their website as well. And I'd really just like to encourage you guys to think creatively as you're integrating these different practices for ecosystem function, as well as, thinking about what are your hopes and dreams for your landscape and how do tree crops fit into that. So feel free to reach out to me. Here's my email address. I'm redoing my website. It's really basic right now. But if you're between here and Lancaster, I will likely be available to come out to your property. So now I'd like to open up for any questions.
Just reminding people to unmute themselves before they speak, because everyone's muted now.
I have a question. First of all, thanks for the presentation. It's really great
Oh, hey.
to get your knowledge on the screen. I was wondering about black locust. I've been thinking about incorporating some of those onto my property. I know they grow really fast, but I'm a little confused about where they are native and where they're invasive.
Yeah.
I live in New York, for those of you who don't know me, which is everybody.
Yeah. They are native in Pennsylvania. I'm pretty sure their range goes into New York. It's sort of like planting mint in your garden, where if you love mint, it's great, but they spread through root sprouts, and they're going to keep growing and coming up. Don't plant them close to your house. Don't plant them close to areas where you'd like to get other things established. But I think that they offer the type of resiliency that our forests need now, with, the invasive species and, the ash trees and the hemlocks taking hits, and the elm trees and the beech trees, and, what's going to be the last tree standing? It might be the black locust. Black locust flowers are edible and delicious. They taste like honey coated sugar snap pea pods. And there's a lot of other experts on this call. If anything I said is not accurate, please chime in. I'd rather be accurate than in isolation. But yeah, I love black locusts. I like to plant them around the edges of where I'm working. They make great hedgerows, and you're going to be managing them on a 12 to 15 year rotation. I plant them usually around 8 feet apart from each other, and depending on what my mechanical needs are, 10 to 12 feet between the rows.
And another question about them is I see them in along the roadways, and I see the little suckers coming up. Can I just dig those up? Do they take well to transplanting?
Absolutely. Yep. Yep. Spring or fall is recommended, but it works in the summer. You want to get, it's going to be hard if it's something that's taller than 2 feet, the taproot. You can't just dig it up and stick it in the middle of nowhere, especially if we're going to keep having droughts like we had this summer. But if you're babying it and you have some root material in what you're growing, it's going to work. It's going to do well. Again, anybody who has other experiences, please chime in. Dale?
Well, yeah, that's really true, but pawpaws are an exception. They're about impossible to dig up root runners and get them to be an established tree.
Yeah.
But a lot of others, just like Andrea said, are really easy that way.
Yeah, hickories too. But if you get them within the first year, you're going to do well. Christy, was your question specifically around black locust transplanting? I just want to make sure I understood that right.
Yep, that's right.
I had a couple of questions if no one else has anything right now. My first question was just the trees that you said earlier that you could just put into a wet soil area and they would usually take root. Was that one of the slides, or is that, I know that was the woman carrying but I wasn't sure what you were talking about.
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. So it's called live staking. And in that slide, there was a wheelbarrow that was full of cuttings that I live stake while they're dormant. So during the winter time before the buds break is the best time to live stake. I usually do it in the springtime. But dogwood shrubs, all kinds of willows, alder, some people have success with sycamore, elderberries, I think Zach's playing with some potentials with hazelnut. Here in Pennsylvania with DCNR, we started the live steak cooperative, where basically you can get free live steaks if you go out and help people take cuttings. Most of that's based out of Selinsgrove and Lewisburg area and up into Center County. But you can also buy live steak material from Ernst Seed Company. You have permission from the landowners. I've had some success with raspberries. I think that's most of the species. Willows traditionally, it's, if you think about the riparian landscape, a willow tree falls over and, might send a branch downstream and then it gets stuck and then the silt falls over and then it starts to root. It's sort of replicating that function. But a lot of the, you need to make sure that they're kept wet. You can't let those root systems dry out.
Okay, thank you. And my other quick question was, I live in Wilmington, Delaware, and I'm in the agriculture world in a couple of different ways, but because of where I'm at, it would be tough for me to really do anything like this. And I'm wondering if you know of any resources. I mean, I do know about Doug Calamay and about how he talks about, rerouting our backyards and making large areas out of small areas. But do you know of any other resources for urban areas that discuss agroforestry?
Yeah. Our friends down in Lancaster, Ben Weiss and the Susquehanna Apothecary, they have an urban agroforestry demonstration farm. And Dale probably knows some more between the Delaware, Wilmington, Chester County area. The Philadelphia Orchard Project is integrating a lot of some native fruit trees on the landscape. Riparian buffers are really an exciting way to create corridors through the urban rural environment. So some of the urban conservation organizations. I don't really have a beat too much on what's going on in Delaware. Not too far to Lancaster, I think. The Keystone Tree Crops Cooperative is collaborating with Michael Judd's organization in Frederick, Maryland called Silviculture. There's a lot of landowners. We're hoping to continue to build a network of people who are, really focused on resource sharing. So you might not have access to a lot of land, but you might be labor rich. So plugging people into these harvesting opportunities to be able to process these value added products. How far are you to Lancaster?
Like an hour.
Oh, okay.
Not too bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't mind going far for learning things. I just really want to implement things here, and we just don't have really much piece at all. And so it would have to be in little pieces, which doesn't really seem conducive to this, but I want to do this. But I guess you just start small and branch out.
I'd like to ask Emily Decker to unmute. I think she had something she wanted to say.
Okay, so hi. I haven't actually Zoomed very much. This is very overwhelming. You did a great job, Andrea. Thank you so much for talking about all this.
Thanks,
so
Emily.
I don't know if you can read my question. I typed it, but I'm accidentally overwintering those elderberry bebes you gave me. I brought them inside, and now they look like it's spring, and I recognize that they need the dormant stage, correct? So I'm just kind of asking and admitting that I brought them inside and am lovingly caring for them.
Yeah, so I have a nursery in Woodward, and basically I just dug a trench in the ground and put anything that's in a pot in the trench and covered over with leaves, and I've never lost anything in the winter, and then in the summertime, everything seems to really thrive in this leaf blanket. But you're right, they need some dormant time. You know, do you have a garage or a shed, or just like, you know, where we are here in Center County, you're not going to be digging the soil. We are frozen hard. We have 6 inches of snow on the ground, and it's not going to be melting for a while here.
My nephew
and
go ahead.
Yeah, so if you can find a big, huge bag of leaves, stick them on the side of stick the flats beside your house and cover them over with leaves. That's what I would do. Or,
well, okay, so
you know,
I'm kind of treating them like houseplants at this point, because now I'm like kind of friends with them. So I just was wondering when the last stage I could put them outside. Like they're sprouting. They look like it's spring. And they did die and then they came back. So I just want them to make it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, elderberries are ridiculously resilient. It sounds like you can do some experiments, and if it fails, I can get you some more.
Cool.
And if it doesn't fail, we can learn from what you learned.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. 90 days maybe of dormant cold. I'm not sure. Elderberries continuously surprise me.
Me too.
I have a question.
Okay.
Yeah, so my husband and I just bought a farm, and we have a beautiful pond that we know has an algae problem, and there's a stream that feeds it, and I think there's a lot of agricultural runoff, especially during heavy rains. We can just like see a horrible stream of mud going right into the pond. We're wondering, do you happen to know any plants that we could plant? Kind of the stream kind of like shallows, and there it seems like there's a lot of area where there's maybe just a couple inches of water where we could maybe get a biofilter type of thing established. Do you have any recommendations about that, or is that kind of outside of your scope?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little bit outside of my scope. I can give you my educated guess. I mean, you know, putting shade, lowering the temperature is going to make a difference in the rate of eutrophication and loss of dissolved oxygen. Talking to your neighbors.
Yeah, that's on the list.
Yeah. You know, Horn Farm, where are you located?
Baltimore County.
Maryland.
Mm-hmm.
Horn Farm's not too far from you. They're in York County, and their woodland steward, who I mentioned before, Wilson Alvarez, is doing some interesting designs with check dams that's reducing sediment. I don't know what I'm imagining. It's pretty flat.
Yeah.
Like it's not coming through. Yeah, I don't really know too much about that in terms of filtration systems. I'm sure there's people on this call that know a lot more about that than I do. Yeah, you know, a lot of these nitrogen fixing trees and shrubs, you want to not plant right along the waterway, because then you're actually bringing nitrogen into the waterway. Watercress maybe. I know that there's a nitrogen fixing azula some people use, and they're harvesting it, using it as chicken feed. When a lot of the exports were prohibited from Cuba and Vietnam, they integrated azula into these systems for basically acting as filters that had ended up being protein-rich chicken feed. I think some of them are edible. AZOLA maybe, I think it's called. It's been a few decades. But I don't know much about that. I'd reach out to Cooperative Extension, see what they have to offer, perhaps.
Awesome. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. I got one more quick one. There's also some trees that the county planted further down. There's a stream. We've got like maybe an acre with oaks, like rows of oaks that I think are about 20 feet apart that we're thinking about alley cropping with. How do you know how close you can get to the trees before you're really disturbing their root zone in a bad way if we're going to work amendments into the soil? Because it's pretty beat down soil, and they didn't do anything to amend it before they planted the trees.
So I know with the silvipastoral systems, they recommend keeping the browse and animals away from 3 feet away from the root system for root health. So it depends on how deep you're digging, but I think if you're doing some shallow amending, I would give it at least 3 feet.
Cool. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Also, thanks, Dale, for the comment about slowing the water. Yeah.
Yeah, slowing the water is great. Also, some of these pond systems, I don't know what the outtake is, but if there's any way that you can draw the water from the bottom of the pond, you can reduce thermal inputs as it's going downstream. Having the water coming off the pond at the top might be 20 degrees different than the water coming from the bottom of the pond or near the bottom of the pond. Oh, you're muted.
Oh, yeah, sorry. There's a drain pipe that like the water comes in from the top and then it goes down about 8 feet before it drains out through a dam. So.
Yeah, if you can do anything you can to get the cooler water into the draining system, that'd be really helpful for your neighbors downstream and eutrophication problems.
I think we need to wrap it up at this point. It's just hitting 8:30. So if you wish to get the link for this recorded Zoomcast, message us at hello@schoolofliving.org or go to our contact page on our website, schoolofliving.org. And thank you. That brings us to the end of the Zoomcast. We'll pass the hat. If you can, please support the work of School of Living and the donation links in the chat box.
And thank you so much, Andrea. That was great. I actually have about 3 hours of questions to ask you. I just kind of have to hold my tongue for now. And please check in the Keystone Tree Crops and see where you might be able to jump into that project.
Yeah, please feel free to email me any questions. And if I don't know the answer, I'll reach out to Dale.
Could I mention one thing? I sent a note to Karen, so we live near Wilmington, but if we close the call, she might not see it. So I don't know how long the chat will be open, but come to Landenberg and visit us. We have a lot of these things going on a real small scale.
That's so exciting. Thank you. I saw it. I wrote it down. I'll email you.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's great, Dale. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks again. And again, the recording will be available soon. We have to process it at this point.
Stay nuts, friends.
Yeah, take care.
Evening.
Good night.
Take care. See you soon.
Bye.
Good night.
Thanks for coming. Thanks, School of Living.